These days, if Samson were alive, how many cars could he lift? 2, 1. 5-ton sedans, one in each hand, or an SUV over 3 tons, raised at least enough to rip its wheels off the ground. And at the gym, how many kilos could he lift easily? 1/2 ton on the bench press, 1 ton on the deadlift, or numbers that make the bar bend before the muscle complains. Think of almost unimaginable comparisons. Holding a helicopter during a rotor torque test, ripping out a light pole with a concrete base, bending a steel H-beam with his forearm, dragging a carnival sound truck uphill, stopping a freight train by pulling the coupler like someone restraining an impatient dog. These are hyperbolic images to measure the unsayable, but to imagine what he would do today, we first need to remember who he was, and above all, where his strength came from, because without understanding the source, any comparison becomes noise. And when the source appears, the narrative begins to gain ballast. Samson appears in Judges 13-16 as a judge of Israel, set apart from the womb by a Nazirite vow, consecration to God that included not cutting his hair, abstaining from wine and anything from the vine, and avoiding impurity. The context is an Israel oppressed by the Philistines. Historical interpretation, this was a time of porous borders, cultural and technological clashes, Philistine iron, and scattered Israelite tribes with temporary charismatic leadership. Central biblical truth, Samson's strength did not come from the hair itself, but from his covenant with God. The hair functioned as a visible sign of an invisible consecration, an unromanticized portrait. He is strong, yes, but also impulsive, sarcastic, at times imprudent, a man of extremes, whose gift goes ahead of him and often exposes him. And if the gift increases reach, failure amplifies impact. This tension between power and limit is what makes his story so human and so dangerous when we forget where the power came from. The announcement of his birth comes through a divine messenger to Manoah and his wife. The boy will be a Nazirite of God from the womb. Historical interpretation, vows and public signs were common in the ancient Near East as markers of identity and mission. In Samson's case, long hair signaled a commitment that set him apart from the common use of strength. Popular myth, the hair was magical, or as soon as it grew, the strength automatically returned. The text paints a deeper picture. When the Spirit of the Lord came upon him, strength broke forth. The hair was the symbol of a living covenant, not a talisman. The danger of confusing symbol and source is great because symbols are visible and comfortable, whereas covenants demand heart, decision, and memory. And when memory fails, symbol turns into fantasy. It is in this gap between sign and substance that Samson's story lights its warnings, preparing the ground for feats that seem impossible and for falls that seem unlikely. Samson was just a muscular man. Delilah cut the hair, and that was it. The strength was gone. It was all salon romance and tragedy. Biblical truths. Scripture does not describe Samson's physique, only the acts the Spirit empowers. The loss of strength is not a scissor trick. It is the collapse of a covenant. Delilah is a final trigger within a sequence of earlier concessions. The fall begins before the sound of the blades, in self-confidence, in spent secrets, in playing with limits. He was a passive victim of a perfect plan. Judges shows repeated choices that narrow the path. In short, the story does not reward muscles, but obedience. It does not indict hair, but the abandonment of purpose. And that is why each extraordinary feat comes with a subtext. What lights up on the outside when, on the inside, the flame is still lit? That question ignored returns with interest in the next chapter. A young lion came roaring. Samson tears it as one tears a young goat with nothing in his hands, because the Spirit of the Lord came mightily upon him. Judges 14. The scene is more than strength. It is a sign of vocation, breaking out in the midst of danger, a rehearsal of that which, if well governed, would deliver Israel. Popular myth: Samson tamed beasts for sport. Correction: the text describes an attack and a lightning response, not a circus. There is also the riddle of the honey in the lion's carcass, which becomes a metaphor for the sweet, bitter tension running through his life. Out of the strong came sweetness. Out of the gift came dilemmas. In each gesture, a suggestion. When impulse meets anointing, the border between courage and imprudence thins, and it is in that thinning that the dissonances begin that later sound loud. The next act brings numbers that astonish and questions that weigh. Armed only with a donkey's jawbone, Samson strikes down 1,000 men, Judges 15, and afterward, exhausted, he cries out, "You have granted this great salvation by the hand of your servant. Now shall I die of thirst?" God splits a hollow place and water gushes out. Interpretation: strength without aid becomes collapse, and aid without gratitude becomes habit. The episode shows that victory may cost more than the battle when the source is not remembered. Popular myth: he was invincible by nature. Correction: the narrative shows him vulnerable, thirsty, dependent. What astonishes is not only the number, but the cycle. Impulse, feat, fatigue, plea, relief. And cycles like this, without discipline, become mazes. The next maze has gates, and not only metaphorical ones. He tore out the doors of the city of Gaza with the posts and the bar. He put them on his shoulders and carried them to the top of the hill that faces Hebron. Judges 16. Gaza was fortified. Doors and posts could weigh hundreds of kilos, perhaps more, especially with crossbars and ironwork. The image is of the enemy's public humiliation. The city wakes up without its own mouth. Popular myth: he ran dozens of kilometers like a marathoner with several tons on his back. Correction: the text does not quantify weight or exact distance. It speaks of a summit in the direction of Hebron. Even so, the scene communicates the essential: strength applied as message, not only as defense. And messages, when they become spectacle, invite unwanted audiences. The next audience answers by a name and at a price. Translating Gaza to today means picturing the ripping out of a reinforced steel gate. Industrial fire doors reach 300 to 600 kilos. Gates with posts and bars can exceed 1 to 2 tons together, and carrying it up a steep hill. Strongman records deadlifts above 500 kg. Yoke carries near 600-700 kilos for a few meters. Walks with brutal loads over short distances. Cranes: a mini crane lifts 2 to 5 tons easily, but with boom, base and counterweights. If Samson lived today, the scene would be equivalent to freeing the lock of an armored gate from its axis, ripping out columns and latches, hoisting it all onto his shoulders, and marching uphill for everyone to see. It's not just load, it's leverage, anchoring, friction, and intent. And the intent here is an announcement. The next announcement asks, what about the cars? A typical car weighs between 1,200 and 1,800 kilos. A large SUV, 2.2, 2.7 tons. A heavy pickup can approach 3.5 T. Strongmen pull 18, 20-ton trucks with ropes and rollers, but pulling is not lifting. Lifting? A front axle, around 800 to 1,000 kilo distributed, a few centimeters, is plausible for record holders with special levers. Raising an entire car off the ground requires equipment. If we project Samson's feats into today in a didactic way, we'd say he could lift the front of an SUV with his hands as if moving a heavy piece of furniture, perhaps single-handedly free a stuck car, possibly rip out a steel obstacle anchored in the ground, where strength isn't just weight, but braking anchorage. These are narrative equivalences, not measurements, and the measure that really mattered wasn't on the scale. And at the gym, how many kilos easily? The human deadlift record is around 500 kilos. Raw bench presses above 300 kilos are rare. Equipped squats top 500 kilos. The language of judges suggests situational peaks of strength when the Spirit of the Lord came upon him. In didactic terms, we could imagine Samson breaking the 1-ton mark in posterior chain movements, a deadlift or an improvised yoke, not as a training routine, but as an eruption. Easily here is a treacherous word. The story speaks of extraordinary feats in critical moments, not sets of 10 reps. And that's why any hypothetical spreadsheet about Samson at the gym ends in ellipses. The ellipses, however, vanish when the subject is character, and that's where the load shifts place. Bending 20mm rebar with bare hands, bracing an automatic gate against its track motor until the motor burns out, tearing an entire chain-link fence anchored in concrete posts, turning a ship's capstan to change the heading of a medium vessel. Holding down a light helicopter on takeoff would be movie physics, but preventing the craft from sliding on a high-friction surface, locking the skid, is an acceptable metaphor to explain torque against low-rolling movement. All this serves a pedagogical purpose, making visible the extraordinary that the text suggests without violating the central fact. The Bible doesn't give numbers. It gives signs, and signs point beyond spectacle, especially when spectacle starts to distract from the vow. And it is precisely when distraction dominates that the fall begins, not with noise, but with choices. Samson's fall was not physical, it was sequential. Marriages and bonds out of purpose, Timnah, playing with secrets, the riddle, casual sex in Gaza, misplaced trust, Delilah, repetition of patterns that little by little weaken inner vigilance. Interpretation, the phrase, "He did not know that the Lord had left him," Judges 16:20, is the heart of the tragedy. The emptying begins inside, long before the cut. Popular myth, the hair fell, the strength ended, the end. My correction. The cut is the inverted sacrament of the break. It makes visible what was already coming apart in the invisible. The symbol succumbed when the covenant was treated as an accessory. And when the essential becomes accessory, the accessory steals the scene. The next scene is a prison and a mill. Delilah insists, Samson yields, the braids are shaved, he is captured, his eyes are gouged out, and he goes to grind in the Philistine prison. Losing sight is also a metaphor. Those who toy with limits lose their reading of the path. The hair begins to grow again, a sign that the symbol can be restored, but it remains to be seen whether the covenant will be. Popular myth, he was just the victim of a femme fatale. Correction. The text holds choices responsible before it blames people. Delilah is part of a Philistine system of oppression, but Samson builds his vulnerability step by step. And even so, the story does not end at the mill. There is a last request, a last strength, a last chance to reroute the gift to its purpose. And the purpose there is deliverance, even if it comes at a high price. In the temple of Dagon, they mock him. Samson asked God, "Remember me and strengthen me only this once, that I may be avenged upon the Philistines for my 2 eyes." Judges 16:28. He leans against the pillars, pushes, the temple collapses. Those he killed at his death were more than those he had killed in his life. The strength is recovered as an answer to prayer, not to a strand that grew. It is an act of judgment against oppressors, not a spectacle of suicide. Necessary distinction in the biblical context, this is self-sacrifice in a battle judgment granted by God, not self-destruction driven by despair. The narrative describes deliverance at an extreme cost. It does not prescribe behavior. It exalts the final faithfulness of someone who, though late, recognizes the source. There is tragedy and there is purpose, and the tension between them is precisely what makes the lesson uncomfortable and fruitful. And the fruitfulness appears when we ask, what in this story crosses the centuries without losing its force? Communities and organizations raise invisible pillars that keep the weight in the right place. Governance, transparency, accountability, real room for warning and for a responsible no. Without this, gates open from the inside in the name of performance, and symbols become ornaments that anesthetize. Uniforms, slogans, roles, and rituals are like hair. They only protect if the cultural covenant is alive. In times of euphoria, an institution needs people with permission to ask hard questions and slow down easy decisions. Otherwise, Delilah becomes house policy, and the scissors are convenience. Metrics are good servants and terrible masters. When they take the throne of purpose, they measure everything except what truly sustains. Collective strength, then, is not in the number of arms, but in the courage to preserve the common vow when applause begs for a shortcut. Today, the vow may sound like simple, stubborn practices, limits on screen time and ego, honored sleep, emotional sobriety, confession before guilt festers, mentorship that interrupts illusions, a schedule that reserves room for silence, prayer, and service. It's the kind of training that doesn't make stories but sustains the evil day. Micro-concessions snip imperceptible strands until the mirror no longer recognizes the face. Small fidelities stitch back what no one sees, and everything depends on. The hair does grow, restoration is possible, but we shouldn't romanticize restarting. It demands repair, restitution where harm was done, patient discipline, and new habits that shield what was once negotiated away. And when the hands return to lifting weight, they choose more wisely for what, for whom, and for how long. That's how the gift ceases to be a show and returns to being a covenant in motion. Talents without character become risk. Strength without limits becomes threat. A gift without covenant becomes burden. Discipline is the adult form of power, the ability to choose what is right when no one is counting, to honor the vow when the symbol seduces more than the substance, to remember the source when applause echoes. Samson reminds us that God can use imperfect people, but that imperfection, if fed, charges its bill in the currency of vision. The true muscle here is faithfulness, the strength you don't see, but that sustains all the others when the lights go out. If he lived today, he might lift cars and gates, What would really matter is whether he would also lift with the same hands the covenant that gives meaning to all of it. Because a gift that forgets where it came from destroys itself under the weight it was born to carry. And the line that remains is as simple as a sign. Stronger than the arms is the promise they obey. If this story helped you see the myth more clearly and apply the lesson to daily life, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. That way, you support the continuity of educational content and deepen conversations that make a difference. Thank you for staying with us this far.